Uh, Thank you for inviting me to deliver the Dan Sanders Memorial Peace and Social Justice Lecture at this 23rd International Consortium for Social Development Conference. I know it's quite late in the conference, and I'm glad that you are all here, at least to listen. I'm particularly honored as Dr. Sanders was not only the inaugural president of one of the founders of the ICSD, but also a distinguished scholar committed to world peace, human rights, and social justice. Distinguished participants of the conference, colleagues, and friends. It's an honor to speak to you today as well. The title of my talk, as was told, that more conflicts, more deaths. Everyone talks about the winning the war, but no one talks about achieving peace. As you can guess from the title, I'm not here to deliver a message of comfort, or I'm going to say everything is good in this world. I'm here to highlight the difficult time the world is currently going through. And it is critically important for all of us to play our part in surviving this crisis. I say surviving this crisis. The most widely used global data on violent conflicts is produced at my Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, which is only 100 kilometers south of here. The 2022 data on conflicts was released just before the summer break. Here in this country, we start the summer break quite late. So it was in June which come out of the data. And that while the number of armed conflicts involving states increased from 54 in 2021 to 55 in 2022. So there's only one increase in the conflict. The number of deaths in these armed conflicts has nearly doubled. In 2021, 120,000 people were killed in these armed conflicts. In 22, it went up to 238,000. It's the Russia-Ukraine war and the conflicts in Tigray region of the Ethiopia are particularly responsible for this massive increase in fatalities in the last year, in 2022. And this number is actually a very conservative number. If you look at the conflicts in Tigray, the number, if given by the UN organizations or even some of the people, those who are engaged in the particularly African Union person who has been responsible for mediation, 500 to 600,000 people have been killed in Tigray. Much, much more than even in the Ukraine. So 2022, the last year, witnessed a rise in non-state conflicts, not only conflicts within the countries, one-sided violence. It's one party which is creating violence in other parts. Number of actors carrying out such violence also increased quite dramatically. The world has not witnessed such deadly conflicts as we have been witnessing now since the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So a relatively peaceful period prevailed in the world during the rest of the 90s after the Rwandan genocide and the first decade of this century as well. This even led some peace researchers, some of my people, people working in the same field in other parts of the world, public intellectuals, to conclude about a decade ago that violence had declined in the world and the world has becoming more peaceful. Some sold many books on that. I'm not going to say who, but there have been some. The so-called Arab Spring shattered those optimistic assertions. And the number of armed conflict has gone up since 2010. Even I wrote a report for the Swedish Army on the Arab, just before Arab Spring came in 2009. I couldn't even anticipate what's going on to happen in that part of the world. So we all got surprised seeing the kind of things which happened in the Arab world that time. And since then, the world in recent years also saw significant increase in the number of non-state armed actors, including rebels, militias, armed traffickers, violent extremists. The global security situation has continued to deteriorate for over a decade now. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 started a major interstate war after a gap of almost 2 decades since the US invaded Iraq in 2003. While the world is more focused on the war in Ukraine, the most deaths occurred, as I mentioned, in the Tigray due to Ethiopia's armed actions against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Although a ceasefire agreement has brought an uneasy cessation of violence in Tigray since November 2022, another violent conflict has erupted in the Amhara region, if you have noticed that, of Ethiopia itself. And the Amhara forces, together with the Eritrean army, were also the main accused committing violence in Tigray on behalf of Addis Ababa. And also a very violent conflict has also started in nearby Sudan since April this year. Violent conflict and state collapses have become common in many West African countries as well. As you can notice what happened recently in Niger, that people are, Nigeria wants to fight a war in Niger on the behalf of France. Violent conflicts, unlike decades ago, are no longer confined to the Middle East. It used to be, we think that conflicts are in the Middle East. That region is experiencing a transition towards a cessation of hostilities. On the other hand, conflicts and displacement have spread to Africa, Europe, Central America, and parts of Asia. Conflicts in 21st century are not anymore limited to poor and underdeveloped countries as it was before. Many middle-income countries like Syria, Libya, Ukraine are experiencing extreme violence. Ethnic and religious violences are spreading all over. In Manipur, India, images of minority women being paraded without clothes and sexually abused by majoritarian mobs have recently emerged. Regional organizations which were praised decades ago for having the needed institutional capacity for conflict management in the regions have failed to perform, including our European Union. The African Union, which has coined the catchy slogan, African, quote unquote, African solution to African problems, but struggled with its limited capacity and capability to overcome a history of conflicts on the continent and find answers to the newly emerging violent conflicts in that part of the world. It failed in Tigray, it fell in Sudan, now Niger, and Amhara. It has also failed to reach an agreement over the sharing of the Nile water. You should be expecting that this is easy to find this between Ethiopia and Egypt, particularly since 2020. They have been engaged, but they have not been able to find an agreement of this. The so-called ASEAN way in the Southeast Asia has also failed the resolving the conflict which is ongoing in Myanmar. Even the member states of the European Union, they have failed to agree on the migration crisis and their approach towards the war in Ukraine. UN peacekeeping operations, which were relatively successful in maintaining and building peace in war-affected countries in the post-Cold War period, have become almost ineffective in carrying out the mandate in the last decade. Most of these peacekeeping operations, which were becoming more, we are trying to, UN was withdrawing, but not anymore. It's getting longer, prolonged, and not able to help the solution. While regional organizations have primarily failed in managing conflicts, the increasingly bipolar world has also reduced the UN Security Council to a talking shop. Unanimity among the big five, and big five, the guys, those who have the veto power, have become almost impossible for a decade now. Preventing the UN from making or taking an effective and unified position on any conflict. As the international community remains divided, several conflicts are also becoming intractable and dangerous due to the involvement of international actors supporting their proxies. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, out of 55 active conflicts in 2022, 22 of them were internationalized, meaning one or both parties in these conflicts have received troops support from other countries or foreign countries. So it's more, conflicts are not anymore, internal conflicts are also becoming internationalized. It's the kind of phenomenon we saw in the Cold War period, like proxy wars. They have become common during the Cold War era, and that phenomenon has returned as major and emerging powers directly engaged in conflict to pursue their strategic and regional interest. This is happening from Ukraine to Niger to Myanmar. Conflicts have become more complex, resistant to resolution due to the flow of money, ideology, arms, and troops from external sources. In many cases, old conflicts are also resurfacing. To summarize, why the world is witnessing more violent conflicts, as I see it, there are three things, three broad and international related factors that can increase the number of violent conflicts worldwide and lead to more violent deaths or fatalities. One, big power rivalry and the divided Security Council. The world is not anymore whatever the kind of formalized unity we had for some years. Active transnational involvement. There are a number of transnational actors which are engaged in this kind of conflict. Number three is the spread of violent extremism and the rise of populism. And these are the three factors. If you put them together, this has created the situation that there are a number of increasing conflicts. There is a number of international actors engaged in other conflicts, and the international community is highly divided to take an approach how to address these conflicts. So more violent conflicts have contributed to causing more famines and displacement, food crisis on the planet, as they are intricately connected. In many cases, established norms of not targeting civilian facilities and infrastructures are not being adhered to during conflicts. These actions are leading to more civilian deaths and sufferings. The threat of using nuclear weapons in a war has disappeared for several decades, particularly since 1990. We were not really talking about the nuclear war, but this is coming up. This is not anymore the nuclear wars in the Korean Peninsula or the India-Pakistan. This is also happening often in Europe. Last week, even Belarus threatening in the nuclear weapons. So this is the cost of these conflicts, whether human, health-related, or economic, have reached a staggering proportion. The increasing insecurity has also led countries to spend more on their military. The world's military expenditure went up by 3.7% in 2022 compared to 2021. So you can imagine how much we have money to spend in the military, but other things we don't. I'm giving it up to your imagination. I'm not getting into detail into what. After the end of the World War II, a collective desire led to the establishment of an international system to prevent violent conflicts by establishing laws, norms, values, and peace mechanisms. However, after nearly 8 decades, this international system appears to be very fragile and highly divided, not only failing to prevent violent conflicts, but also failing to prevent turning violent, much more violent, but also struggling to bring an early end to the conflicts, which you used to do at least some years, decade or 2 decades back. And war must need to end for development and security. The concept of development has become closely linked to the concept of security in this century. This development security nexus is not only present in academic literature, but has also become the main focus of international development assistance. While focusing on this development and security or focusing on the interrelationship is important, a key question arises. Whose development and security are prioritized when rich industrialized countries provide aid and assistance? When we provide aid and assistance, do we really ask that time the question, whose security, whose development they do have in mind? Unfortunately, most cases, the aid givers' development and security take precedence over the needs of the countries that truly require assistance. This issue is not limited to the US, UK, and France. Even countries like Sweden have fallen into this agenda. While every international organization and multilateral institutions claim to work for development and security, the world is rapidly entering into an era of conflict and violence. The UN Secretary General recently warned that global peace is more threatened now than it has been in the last 8 decades since the end of the World War II. Although the world is currently witnessing the highest number of violent armed conflicts since 1945, 1/4 of its population lives in the conflict-affected areas. UN peace operations are also becoming longer in duration, as I mentioned, and their outcomes are becoming more uncertain. Multilateral peacekeeping is not effective today as it was during the golden period in the 1990s. Almost 90 million people have been displaced due to conflict and violence. Nine times Swedish population. And the UN estimates that the 339 million people worldwide will require humanitarian assistance in this year, 2023. Peace is much more than the absence of war. We are talking about the conflict, violence, war. But peace is much more, is different. Given this context, it becomes necessary to ask, what is peace? Is it merely the absence of war? If the absence of war defines peace, then the world may appear more peaceful than in the previous century. I'm talking about the war, interstate war. Actually, this is the question I was asked by the UN's UNESCO last year to write, because the UNESCO is bringing out a new document to advise the countries in the world, because after 50 years, they have to say how the peace education to be taught, education on peace to be taught in the different parts of the world, different countries. And they wanted me to define what is peace. I defined it the way I wanted to, but it went through the different stages of their negotiation. It looks very different than what I defined. But that's another question. That happens in the UN system. In recent decades before 2022, countries other than the US have rarely waged war against each other. All the wars were waged by US before 2022, actually. The troops of the, I'm talking about in the last 2 decades. The troops of the US and Russia have not fought each other for over a century directly. India, Pakistan haven't gone to war for more than half a century. If the world is indeed that peaceful, why do countries feel so insecure, accumulate weapons so much, and invest so heavily in their armed forces? Furthermore, why are so many people dying and being displaced due to violent conflicts? The world spends 2.24 trillion annually on military expenditure. And the amount spent on armed forces in 2020 was nearly 10% higher than what it was in 2011. Imagine, look at the 2.24 trillion on the military, and the same world has failed to put $100 billion on the climate change fund. But the US Congress approved a military expenditure of $768 billion for 2022, the largest defense spending bill in the country's history. You expect Biden to come to cut down the military expenditure, put the money on the social security, but he gave the military budget than it has never been before. In 2021, China increased its defense budget by 6.8%. And in 2022, India increased its budget by 9.8% compared to previous years. There is a substantial gap between the actions or claims of countries to maintain peace and the actual threats to peace, both existing and emerging. Peace doesn't belong exclusively to countries or solely in the context of war. Although countries are not engaged in many wars, the threat of war has not disappeared. It's premature to predict that the decline in the number of wars is permanent, and the wars that are being fought have also become deadlier. Most nuclear-armed countries have reduced the number of nuclear weapons. Only countries those who are increasing nuclear weapons officially are China, India, Pakistan, and now probably UK. But other countries, they have those who are the main keeper of the nuclear weapons, Russia and the US, they have reduced nuclear weapons quite substantially, but have made them more lethal, even if they have reduced it. Although the last century witnessed 2 world wars, if another world war, we all talking about the world war, if another one was to occur in this century, there might be no survivors. There will be no building or no lectures like this ever. So the nature of war is rapidly changing. Digital attacks are also often carried out on a limited and controlled scale by conflicting countries. That's a different stage of the war has reached. A full-scale cyber war between enemy countries can cause comparable or even greater harm than a traditional war. Am I okay with? I might need a little more. Okay. Moreover, combat in cyberspace is highly unpredictable, difficult to measure, and nearly impossible to prevent. Since the beginning of this century, the emergence of hybrid warfare has further blurred the distinction between war and peace. Hybrid warfare integrates cyberspace into warfare, combining conventional and unconventional forces and tactics. Non-state actors play a critical role in hybrid warfare. Wars are no longer confined to or controlled solely by countries, and armed forces are no longer the sole actors in this situation. So for those who have chosen to overlook the biggest picture or bigger picture and continue to measure peace solely in the context of war, the changing nature and actors of the warfare have compelled them to reconsider their definition of peace. Peace is not merely the absence of war. In 2014, then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, "We know that peace cannot be decreed solely through treaties. It must be nurtured through the dignity, rights, and capacities of every man and woman." Peace is not exclusive to nations. It's primarily about people. Peace encompasses both negative aspects, such as the absence of war, and positive aspects, such as the absence of causes of war. Peace exists both externally and internally, and the two are interdependent. Internal peace serves as the core foundation of a country to act and promote peace with others. External peace enables a country to work towards internal peace by focusing on providing rights, justice, equal opportunity to its people. So these are two interrelated things. The modern globalized world has created an environment that gives rise to the new challenges for countries striving both external and internal peace. Unconventional threats like climate change, environmental scarcity, large-scale human migration, food and water scarcity, loss of biodiversity, and increasing pandemics pose serious challenges for countries aiming to achieve both external as well as internal peace. These non-military threats are also interconnected, and a threat to one country or region often becomes a threat to all. Peace is difficult to localize in a globalized world. The new threats to an inclusive concept of peace have made the world mutually vulnerable, regardless of strength, wealth, and geographical location. The increasingly ambiguous and inclusive nature of measuring peace is now unavoidable. The world and its problems have become complex and diffusive, demanding a more comprehensive approach to the addressing these challenges. These are the things which I told the UNESCO. They have changed it, but I'm now telling it to you. So you know what I had told, but that's not you won't see. Finding an inclusive approach to working of peace is necessary, as maintaining security through nuclear or military deterrence has lost much of its significance. While the threat of interstate wars cannot be denied, the new reality presents numerous others and more complicated challenges. The newly emerging threats are not conventionally armed, but have a global reach with severe consequences. Countries need to adopt a more complex and comprehensive approach to analyze their strategy for achieving peace and security beyond the traditional prism of military power. Increasing military strength and spending are neither sufficient to win new types of war nor capable of effectively addressing emerging conventional security threats. Despite we are spending $2.24 trillion every year on military, we haven't stopped the conflicts, we haven't stopped the violence. Therefore, the challenge for countries is to create a new sustainable and people-centric peace architecture that effectively and inclusively deal with the complex challenges of global peace in the 21st century. Peace is a prerequisite for sustainable development and comprehensive security. In general, societies that are more peaceful tend to be more prosperous and secure. Peace creates an environment for a society to progress and thrive. The absence of armed conflict allows states to allocate human and economic resources to critical infrastructure, improve healthcare and education, and strengthen the rule of law. A conflict-ridden country can never provide a conducive business environment. A thriving business sector plays a central role in maintaining peace, and its growth depends on the stable and conflict-free environment. Violence significantly contributes both directly and indirectly to food insecurity in conflict-affected regions. In 2020, armed conflict forced 130 million people into acute food insecurity. Peace is crucial not only for food security, but also water, energy, and health security. Armed conflicts disrupt water system, both accidentally and intentionally, which are essential for human and environmental well-being. The strong connection between conflicts and energy supply has been established for over a century, and the Ukraine war has once again heightened why peace is vital for a global energy security and also food security. It's evident that during the violent conflicts, health security is compromised for affected population as well. The causes of violent conflicts vary greatly between countries and regions, but their impacts on development and security is consistently negative. Conversely, the link between peace, equitable development, and comprehensive security is very straightforward. While international development agencies and multilateral institutions prioritize sustainable development goals, the world is witnessing increasingly violent conflicts. So you can't have a sustainable development goals when you have this increasing number of violent conflicts. So the international community focus should be on ending all armed conflict. If its genuine aim is to make progress in promoting development and security for the global south. And that's not happening. Rich industrialized countries are directly or indirectly involved in almost every ongoing armed conflicts in the world, everywhere. Every effort should be made to end wars where one country fights against another. The US has been engaged in wars continuously since 2001. And Russia has been at war since previous year. No war is justifiable, regardless of the parties involved or the reasons presented. No war is justifiable. Armed conflicts only bring deaths and destructions. They preclude any possibility of development and security. Additionally, vital resources are diverted to warfare instead of being invested in society's sustainable growth and well-being. It does not only in the developing world, also the developed world. And now I'll go a little bit into a bit controversial thing, but as you can expect, you don't expect me to tell all the non-controversial things, so I will do that. In a recent interview with the British news magazine On Ahead, which garnered a bit more attention than expected. Of course, some of my interviews are always a little bit, they take more attention than I had expected in the beginning. I was asked by its editor-in-chief about the vanishing anti-war movement in the West. Why the war? He asked me why there are no anti-war movements taking place in the West. This is an incredibly important question that necessitates careful consideration and explanation. During the 1960s and 70s, the US and Europe witnessed a rapid rise of anti-war movements that opposed the Vietnam War. These movements garnered widespread support from various socio-economic groups, acted as a potent check against the governments prone to favoring war and militarization over diplomacy and negotiation. The end of the Cold War didn't extinguish anti-war activism. The anti-war protests were particularly pronounced during the Iraq War. Even during the Iraq War, we witnessed a number of anti-war movements, particularly in the US. The world has recently experienced a dangerous escalation in violent armed conflicts. More people, including a substantial number of civilians, are dying due to war. The number of refugees is increasing annually. Countries are acquiring weapons on unprecedented scale, and the threat of nuclear weapons use has become a regular occurrence. Most concerning of all, for the first time in the past 60 years, the world is witnessing a direct confrontation unfolding between NATO and Russia. The Ukraine war, which began in February 2022, not only persists, but has resulted in devastating destruction. While there is no end in sight to this human tragedy, NATO's involvement in the conflict raises genuine concern about the outbreak of another global war. Amidst the world teetering on the brink of self-destruction, the disappearance of anti-war movement in the West is deeply troubling. Those who oppose war and violence are now being portrayed as supporters of authoritarianism and dictatorship. Individuals who are against military alliances or escalating military expenditure are labeled as traitors and foreign agents. However, these accusations and labels have not deterred many from protesting against wars in the past, whether it is in Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq. So what makes the war in Ukraine is different? Is the location of the war or the current time that has discouraged people, advocates of peace, from taking into the street? If the war in Ukraine being in the backyard of Europe dissuades peace activity in Europe and Sweden, such reasoning doesn't adequately explain the absence of anti-war activism in North America, because Ukraine is not in their backyard. Why there is no anti-war movement in the North America? The racial and religious affinity with the perceived victims should not be a convincing argument either, as these divides are not present between the conflicting parties in this war. So it's not between two races the fight is going on. What makes more sense in understanding the silence of peace proponents of that civil society in this part of the world is largely convinced that Western liberal democracies are forces for good. These democracies can do no wrong, particularly when it comes to the protecting democracies from authoritarianism and dictatorship. Thus, for those who used to protest against the war, this particular war has become a good war. It's worth noting that no war can be truly labeled as a good war. The US, another good war, which the US was supposed to war on terror over the last 22 years, has directly caused the threats of nearly 1 million people and indirectly led to the deaths of about 4 to 5 million people, primarily innocent civilians. War is not only the only solution to the conflict. While Western countries have been increasing their military expenditure substantially, including in this country, they have concurrently reduced budgets for diplomatic missions. I'm done soon. Thank you. Diplomacy and development aid. We are reducing all this. We are reducing even diplomatic missions in Africa. We're closing down many in the different parts of the world. Our development budget is cut. In Sweden, for funding for research on developing countries has been cut. Those who are doing research on developing countries in Sweden, they know what happened. And the explanation is the Ukraine war. The pursuit of victory in war has become so addictive that Western liberal democracies seem to have forgotten the fundamental principles of humanitarian laws and norms. They have no qualms about supplying, using, and threatening to use weapons of mass destruction. Recently, the US even supplied cluster bombs to Ukraine for use within the Ukrainian territory, a decision that will result in deaths and injuries of Ukrainians for generations, because these arms, the cluster bombs, will be used within the Ukrainian territory. After the Russians withdrew, these will kill the Ukrainians for generations to come. But nobody is objecting to it. So the absence of anti-war activism has granted liberal democracies in the West a free rein to wage wars in the name of protecting democracies from authoritarianism. However, it is contradicted to claim to fight for democracy while aligning with leaders like Erdogan of Turkey and Modi of India. You can't have both. If you are really supporting democracies, how can you align with these idiots? Or autocrats, let me put it that way. The decline of anti-war protest, this is my last one, okay? The decline of anti-war protest is not emblematic of a general trend in activism within the West. It's not that the people are not being active anymore. We have peace activists has become a rare breed. Western societies are witnessing a surge in protest against climate change, gender inequality, racial discrimination. We saw all these kind of movements coming up all over. Many activists and organizations that were once part of anti-war demonstration are now mobilizing people around environmental and identity issues. This change in strategy is likely a safer option than being labeled as a foreign agent, if you talk about peace, particularly as nationalist sentiment surge within the liberal democracies in Europe and the US and Canada even. However, these activists must recognize that no society or country can prioritize sustainable development, gender and racial equality, and economic well-being while being embroiled in long-lasting wars. You cannot have war at the same time. You can have this gender equality, sustainable development, and environmental protection. You can't have that. So while nearly everyone in the West talks about winning wars, regrettably, very few speaks about achieving peace, or no one. Even if anti-war voices cannot prevent wars, I'm not saying that can prevent wars, but their presence is vital for keeping war-inclined political leaders in check. They can't just keep on doing anything that they can take the money and give it, or what kind of weapons they can supply. Those things should be stopped. Because and also to limit the scope and perils of broader conflicts. We need to keep the political elites in check, that making the conflict much broader than what it is already. Above all, diverse voices are essential for functioning democracy. In a democracy, we should have diverse voices. Why we're not allowed to have that diverse voices? Democracy loses its essence without dissenting perspective. So if we are really claiming that we are protecting a democracy, we are really killing at the same time our own democratic values by not really questioning what we are going to do or what we are doing in that to protect that democracy. Anti-war protests are crucial not only for peace, but also for the preservation of democracies in the West. Peace is an essential prerequisite for social development, human progress, and sustainable development. The time has come for us to raise our voice and for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.